Hello and welcome to Meta Business Podcast. My name is Alexei, and today I've got a special guest, Martin von Stein. How you going, Martin?
Doing well, thanks, Alexei.
Martin runs a business called Bizguard, and he does a whole bunch of different things from the IT perspective. And I won't ruin it because I think Martin is not only good at what he does, but has obviously got a bit of a story to tell about his business and how he transitioned into it. But most importantly, how he helps customers right now. So, Martin, tell us about Bizguard.
Sure. Well, I think to tell you about Bizguard, I need to tell you a little bit about me, and how I came to kind of where I am now.
Hmm.
So my IT career started as I was a teenager, almost about 30 years ago. I like to think the origin part was where I started actually taking the family computer apart on the kitchen table, and my mum was there freaking out that I couldn't put it back together again. But of course I did, and all the screws went back in. And that was really kind of where I went, okay, you know what? I actually can do this. I'd already had kind of a spark before that, but that was where I went, all right, this is actually a thing I want to do. So then did the usual stuff, studied, went out and got my first job. But I've been working in the IT industry now for roughly 25 years, and most of that's been outsourced. So I've worked with pretty much every kind of business you can imagine. I've worked in every industry, every size of business, government, private enterprise, you name it. And did the usual kind of thing that you do when you build an IT career. You start working with smaller businesses, and then you progress, or I guess upgrade, as a lot of IT people view it, to working with larger businesses, and then you graduate to working with enterprise and working with government. And in that entire trajectory, I gained a whole lot of extra skills and got a lot of insights around businesses, and was a business owner for a while in the middle there as well. But I got to a point where I really wanted to do a bit of a life check, and it coincided not exactly with my 40th birthday, but it was pretty close. It was around there where I went, I really need to just take stock and see if what I'm doing makes sense for me. And it was interesting because timing wise, a couple of old small business clients I used to look after actually reached out to me and asked me what I was doing. And what I really realized as I kind of peeled back the layers of the onion is that small businesses really do struggle a lot more with IT than I think I realized. Because I've been working more or less in corporate, for the couple of years at that point. And when you're working with corporate IT, you get access to all the good toys, all the good cybersecurity services. You have people who understand risk management and all of those good things. And small business owners largely are just driven by their day to day a lot of the time, and they don't have time to look at a lot of these things in depth or employ expensive consultants to tell them what they need to do. And so I thought there's got to be a sensible way that we can take all of that goodness and all of the tech stuff that the mid-market and up has access to, but make it really digestible and affordable for small business. So that's basically how Bizguard came about. So the original vision that I had was cybersecurity based, because that was the biggest gap that I saw. And obviously cybercrime's just going absolute gangbusters at the moment, which is not really great for anyone except for the criminals. And with small businesses getting targeted more, I thought, right, well, that's got to be where I go. And I built a small business offering around cybersecurity. Those couple of business owners that I was dealing with said, yes, we want that, we want that. Showed them what I had planned, what I was looking at charging, and they all kind of went, ooh, we're not really sure we actually want to pay for that. But could you just do our IT? And that's where I went, all right, tell you what if I charged you that, I did this, and this as part of your IT, but you just got the cybersecurity included? And they went, oh yeah, we love that. Let's do that instead, right? So that was where I kind of cracked the nut of the model. So that really became the core business model of Bizguard today, which is that we offer a suite of services predominantly around 365, although we are about to launch our Google product as well. But what we're doing with the majority of our clients right now is we're managing their Microsoft 365. So that's the first piece. We take accountability for that. But then we also take the cybersecurity side of the business and wrap that up, right? So the idea is that you've got protection and backup around 365, and you've got protection around your desktops and endpoints as well, and your people. And by doing that, it basically means that we take this thing, which Microsoft 365 is a really complicated beast, right? Which no one's really accountable for in a small business. Even if you're paying someone per hour to look after your IT, they're not really taking responsibility for that. So we take accountability for making sure it's managed and secure properly, and then we wrap the cyber around the whole business. And that model seems to be working really, really well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I've got an IT background myself. I mean, I studied at QT, and I've gone through just about every single major. So I did sort of try to get into that space when I was still at uni, and I found it wasn't for me. But what I have learned is that a lot of the time, the whole managed IT and the whole IT solutions has to be really seamless. So, which means that a lot of the time people don't really see the problems that are occurring, and you have to make sure that everything sort of runs like a clock. And then essentially things like cybersecurity, which is what you sort of referred to before, is one of those things that essentially gets a reaction once something actually does get hacked or doesn't go the way it's supposed to go. And then you're supposed to come up with a miracle solution in the record period of time. So I find that these two things are quite contradicting in the sense that, hey, majority of business owners would look at it as a IT managed solution, but in reality, they have very, very different complex structures that do allow for seamless operation. Which I agree, majority of business owners don't really have the time to really address properly, and I think a lot of the business owners just probably don't know what they don't know. Like they don't know the basics of what they're supposed to have as a setup. I mean, I think a lot of people just go, hey, I've got my email set up, I've got my website, I've got my little cloud, and off it goes. And until something happens, I don't really know what to ask for. So, in terms of your expertise, how do you start the conversation about things like cybersecurity with small businesses? Because I think you've nailed it on the head. Like bigger businesses, they're a lot more structured. There's quality control, which identifies all the risk factors. But with small businesses, the conversation just doesn't start. So, in terms of your expertise, how do you start that conversation about cybersecurity with small businesses?
So I'm gonna peel it back one layer and then come around back to answering that question because I think it's important to really understand the premise of what we do and why we do it. The IT services model for small business is fundamentally broken, right? So what you effectively have is you have three different business models around IT, and I'm going to call them business models. One of them is not really a business model. One is trying to do it yourself, right? So unless you've got an IT background, that's a dangerous route to go as a small business owner. But many are forced that way because they either can't afford or don't know what else to do. So that leaves us with two actual commercial models for doing IT. One is the what's called the break fix model. So that's where you basically never hear from the IT guy unless you've got a problem. You call them, they bill you per hour. Maybe they send you a monthly bill for your Microsoft licensing or something like that. But there's no transfer of accountability or responsibility around anything technology related in your business to that IT person. They literally just, they're on call, right? Now, what's been happening over the last probably 15 years, really, really powerfully, is the IT industry has been shifting. And there's been this shift to the managed services model, which is really about taking that break fix aspect and turning it into a monthly fee where the IT responsibility is largely outsourced to the provider. Now, that comes with a lot of benefits for the provider. And depending on the client, it can be a good fit as well, but it's also a great way to spend lots of money for very little result. So typically those sort of services, they're billed as a $100 to $200 per user per month kind of basis. They typically include all you can eat technical support, which is all great. But if you're not going to need that and use that level of support, then you're kind of just paying for nothing, right? So again, not talking about the mid-market, not talking about enterprise, those models all have kind of places. But in the small business market, there's really a need for us to say, well, what are the best parts of both of those models? And then how do we bring that together into something that makes sense? And that's why our model, which is the it's a hybrid model, right? So there is a monthly fee component that includes certain hygiene things that every small business just needs. You can't not have this stuff. And if you put a small business owner in the position of having to make a decision about should they have this bit or should they have that bit, they're likely to compromise themselves because they just don't know. They don't understand why these things are important. And you know what? They shouldn't really have to. So what we do is we give them the stuff that they absolutely need as bare essentials. But then things like tech support, you know what? A lot of businesses have got that young fella out front who they just employed recently and knows his way around a computer and can probably Google what that error message means and fix it themselves and save themselves $100 for a call out, right? So that's where we take the approach of saying, well, we want to give the customer the ability to control some of that cost. So I want to now come back to your question of how do we approach the conversation with clients? Well, we approach it by starting and saying, this is how IT should be done, right? Is that there are things that you need, but you have absolutely no idea how to assess or understand the value of these things or understand exactly how to measure between providers to see whether you're getting quality, right? But we're just going to call it out and say you need cybersecurity, you need backups, you need to have your Microsoft 365 managed if you have that platform. And most small business owners will agree 100% of the time with those three things being important in principle, right? So we get that out of the way. We say, right, well, we'll do that. Here's a low monthly fee. What else you got? Right. And then it's a case of, oh, they'll have some legacy of problems and that's great. We'll give them a quote to fix that, or they might have a really crappy internet link and we can replace that, or they might need a new computer and we can do that as well. But it really just becomes a a non-issue because what we're doing is agreeing in principle that there are certain fundamentals that are important. And as long as we can come to that agreement, we don't need to worry about exactly what the technology is or exactly the methodology. Of course, we can answer those questions if they come up, but most small business owners just want to know, oh, someone's got my back, right? I don't need to worry about this stuff anymore. And that's really the path the conversation takes most of the time.
Well, look, from that perspective, I can certainly see how managed IT, in the way you describe it, could potentially work for small businesses based on, I guess, the number of critical events, if you want to sort of describe it that way. But if we look at companies like Optus, for example, that's a great example where managed IT services that's been outsourced overseas has gone completely wrong. And I think it could work, but potentially the greater the company is in terms of size and complexity, the greater the risks are. And it always fascinated me how some businesses are operated on a larger scale, very similar to a small business in terms of model and approach. You're finding that a lot within the IT industry, that big companies are sometimes operated from a small business mindset when it comes to IT and technology.
It varies. So the primary thing that I've seen in larger businesses is that they become very siloed in how they approach things, and IT will generally have enough gravitas in the organization. They can mandate certain things, and those things are normally around what I call IT hygiene. So they might mandate that devices have to be managed a certain way, or they might mandate that we're going to do X, Y, and Z with the email platform. But you still end up with these business silos where decisions are made around things like applications and around data. And really, that's where most security issues come into play. Most hacks are not happening because someone forgot to close that port on the firewall. That's, it does happen, but that's not the majority of it. The majority of it is user error. The majority of it is data left in places where it's insecure, or it's application access not restricted properly, and then someone gets in that way. So there's a lot of issues with siloing in organizations and distributed decision making, and there's no easy answer to that either, by the way, because the problem is that no matter what you do, people are going to always wrestle with each other over things. You mandate what apps they can use, but they don't want to use those apps. They're going to find a way to use the apps they want, right? So it is a really, really difficult problem, and if there was an easy answer, then everyone would be doing it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess what you're saying is, the technology, I guess, is pretty good in a sense of being used, but it's the users, it's the habits that users basically have in place to store data like passwords and so on that really creates all the problems. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Look, I think what I'm saying is that humans are not just the majority, but probably all security issues start and end with humans, right? Even technology issues, because technology is created by humans, right? So one way or another, process and human issues are really at the root of all security problems. But really the key issue is behavior, right? So when we're talking about actual, developers will make mistakes. There'll be bugs in software that can be exploited, and then they'll fix those things. Those kinds of things are very, very hard to address, except through just rigorous testing and that kind of thing. But in terms of organizational security, really user behavior becomes very challenging, because you're not dealing with necessarily professional behavior and doing all the right steps in a process. You're dealing with just really basic things like not reading out passwords out loud, or not writing down passwords in silly places. And the thing is, you can't train people out of some of those behaviors because they're just accustomed to doing it a certain way. And so really, at the end of the day, when we're approaching people, it's all about education. And that's a really, really big part of my philosophy, is that you have to educate people, but it's not about addressing general ephemeral concepts like, oh, let's go and talk about why it's important to keep your passwords safe. It's just doing generic training like that really doesn't land, right? It's not real for people. So one of the things, not to sort of spruik specifics too much, but we do have something coming with one of our vendors that's really exciting, where we'll be able to offer user training relating to the actual behavior being observed at the time. So an example of that is that if security software is observing that they're using highly insecure passwords, so really low complexity passwords in their apps, it can actually at that point offer them remediary training to say, hey, here's how you actually set better passwords. And then what we're really hoping is that by connecting the behavior with the learning opportunity more closely, it becomes more real for people. The other thing that we found really successful is personalizing the education. So when we're talking to someone about, hey, let's talk about passwords, right? I'll just keep picking on that example. It's not just about this is why you should set secure passwords to keep your business safe. Because the average employee, do they really care about the business? Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it's also about how they keep themselves safe. So we personalize and say, hey, you apply these same things in your personal life. You know, if you don't do this, someone could hack into your bank account and steal your money. All of a sudden, the light bulb goes on, right? It becomes real because now they're personally impacted as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I found, through our agency working with quite a few clients that every time there's something new that comes up, and it's relatively common sense, but you don't really address something like that until the event occurs. So, for example, one of our customers has been sharing their passwords with third parties, basically creating things like content for the websites and whatnot, and they had no procedures around it, managing those passwords, having like a expiry date on those accounts. So if they engage someone and provide them with access, nothing has been changed or anything like that. And I think you're right. It's more of a gap to understand exactly what the processes are within the organizations and really tailor to it. So from this perspective, I can certainly see how IT companies and providers can really tailor to each company based on the processes, based on the offering, and I guess how they engage third parties as well. Are you finding, are you finding that there's any issues with the third parties and lack of process in place from your perspective? I mean, small business obviously is fairly simple when it comes to that, but are you seeing that there's an issue with procedures, policies, and whatnot?
Yeah, look, there is. And I think your mention of third parties is actually a really critical one that a lot of people don't kind of grasp. And again, this is not casting judgment on small businesses because small business owners have got more on their plate than ever, right? Especially from a digital perspective. But there is a real challenge in not just managing internal risk, but managing what's called third party risk. And that's something most small businesses do quite poorly. In fact, a lot of mid-sized businesses still struggle with that. And again, you can take it to the nth degree, but it's even just basic stuff. Like every business, no matter of size, should have a supplier payments policy that covers things like if we get a notification that bank account details have changed, what is our process for validating that that's actually correct? Let's not trust the email. Let's not trust the fact the invoice has a banner on it that says, hey, these are our new bank account details. Let's actually make an offline phone call to a number that we have on file already and validate that those are correct bank account details. So that's just one example of third-party risk management. It's really important in that sense because it protects your money in the bank, obviously. But there's also other things where there are key questions that you can and perhaps should be asking your suppliers, depending again on how you work with them and what you consume from them, about how they're managing their own security. Because ultimately, what they're doing in their backyard can really impact you and your business as well. And I think there's a gradually raising level of understanding and appreciation of that, especially as more supply chain attacks happen in the public eye. And we start hearing things about, well, I mean, CrowdStrike was a great example, right? That wasn't even an attack, but it made everybody intrinsically aware of the fact that here is a third party that has such a major impact over our technology. So even though it wasn't a security incident as such, or arguably it was because availability incidents, technically you could still classify as security, but it made everyone acutely aware of the fact that there are third parties that have got access into your business and can impact your business, even if you're doing all the right things.
Yeah, well, that's a great example because I think majority of people have never even heard about a company called CrowdStrike before that incident, and I don't think a lot of people even realize that Microsoft outsourced any of their stuff to third-party contractors. So, can you tell us maybe a little bit more about the actual event and how you sort of look at it from that perspective? And because I do get asked quite a lot, what's the deal with CrowdStrike? Is it likely to happen again? How does that work? Can you explain to our listeners?
Yeah, for sure. So CrowdStrike is a security product. So it's a little bit like antivirus plus plus plus, does a whole lot more, but it effectively fulfills the role of an antivirus if you want to put it simplistically. Because of it doing that role, it has very low level access to the operating system. So it can intercept programs before they're running and things like that. So in technical parlance, that's called kernel access. So the kernel is like the absolute guts of the operating system where all the magic happens. And certain apps like CrowdStrike have access into that kernel to be able to manipulate the operating system. It's a really fundamental part of the security protection that CrowdStrike provides, and it's not unique to them. There's dozens, perhaps hundreds of other vendors that operate with the same kind of model. So that's a privileged level of access that obviously comes with a degree of responsibility, and the onus is on the vendor providing the software to make sure that everything they do with that is tested properly. What we really saw with CrowdStrike is what can happen when testing goes wrong. So the again, depending on who you want to believe, there's always a sugar coating over the top of some of these releases from the vendors. But if you read between the lines, it's pretty clear that they've admitted that they did not test their updates properly, and in fact, disastrously so. They had a very, very poor testing process. So typically, what would happen is before an update gets pushed out, is a vendor would do the final builds and coding and all the technical stuff, and then they would actually put it through its paces and make sure it doesn't break anything before that starts going out to real life machines. And then what would also happen generally is you'd have what's called a pilot group, which would be a selection of customers that get it first, and you let it sit for a minute to make sure it doesn't break anything before you roll it out everywhere. CrowdStrike didn't do any of that, right? So they basically just pushed the go button on a Friday afternoon, which is, by the way, the worst time to do an update. And then it's just had that massive impact. And of course, poor Microsoft was stuck there having to go, it's not us, honest, it's not us. But the interesting implication of that is people going, well, was that necessary? Did they need to even do that update? What even was that? And that's a really interesting point, because that update was just a standard update that they do a couple of times a week. It just so happened that this one had some bugs in it. But the nature of this update and the reason these updates are important is because they're constantly protecting and providing updates to the protection against new threats. And as threat actors or cyber criminals continue to evolve their methods, it's really important for the security software that stops them to also be up to date. So it's kind of this tug of war where, on one hand, you want the updates to happen as often as possible and as quickly as possible to provide protection, but you do have to counterbalance that against quality control and testing, because otherwise you end up creating an incident rather than solving one.
Yeah. Well, it was quite alarming that a huge company like Microsoft could allow something like this to happen. But what I found a little bit surprising was for an update like that to be rolled out in Australia and the Asian markets on a Friday, which is something that they teach you first thing at university. Never do any updates on a Friday. And their response was quite interesting. They actually said, "Look, we actually did it on a Thursday because we're in the US." And it's like, well, you know what? There's actually the rest of the world that you have to think about. But it's I think you're right. It sort of comes back to that human error, and I think a lot of assumptions as well. And I think this is where the whole IT side of things doesn't work on its own. This is where you do need that human input. You do need some common sense, which I think is what tools like AI potentially lacking at the moment, because someone still has to drive it and make some decisions based on the whole thing. Which brings me to my next question. What's your take on AI? I mean, I know that Microsoft has heavily invested into ChatGPT and has obviously got this Copilot. How are you sort of seeing the impact of that for small businesses?
So I think I can probably summarize somewhat my view on AI through what I'm sure will be a misquote from Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park, where he says, "We're so busy being preoccupied with whether we could, we never stopped to think about whether we should." And AI is a little bit like that. So AI has incredible promise, and it does have an awful lot of power. I use AI, right? It's absolutely a tool that if you're not out there at least playing with it, understanding it, you're going to be left behind for sure. But at the same time, I think we're starting to see it used a little bit too liberally. We're starting to see research come back now, which actually shows consumers moving away from technology, so consumer technology that incorporates AI or has AI in its branding. And I think a lot of it is because people already have a feeling or a sentiment that technology is coming between us in human interaction, and AI is just seen as another way for corporate Australia to push another layer of tech in between people, right? That seems to be the sentiment, at least at a consumer level. So I think that's where AI to me has a little bit of a split. And I think a lot of the technology we're seeing now around AI phone calls, certainly things like AI text messaging, AI email writing, all of that stuff absolutely will continue to get used because people will always try to find lower cost ways of touching their clients. But at the same time, I think we're going to see progressively more of a reaction against that kind of thing. And we're going to see consumers, I think, placing a greater value on human connection and businesses that offer access to human beings. What we might also see is businesses charging a premium for that. So I think the economic outputs of all of that are going to be really, really interesting. But there's a second side to AI, which is utilizing it to create content and to augment what people are doing in terms of processes in the business. And I think that's really where the current power of AI is undoubtedly at. I think if you're producing content and you're suffering from a blank page issue where you just don't know what to do next, AI is a fantastic brainstorming tool. if you don't quite know how to navigate a situation, AI is a great tool to just bounce some concepts and ideas off. But I think the one thing that we all need to be very cautious of, especially around content, or anytime we allow AI to write something for us, is that it's drawing from a common set of knowledge and set of words, if you will. And so what I am seeing is that it's almost becoming obvious when something is AI written and someone hasn't taken a great deal of care in how they've used it, because it sounds very generic, it sounds very bland. So every time I use AI, it always talks about improving efficiencies and streamlining operations. And those are just words that I've actually configured a prompt to tell it not to use those words specifically, because it uses them all the time. Every other bullet point seems to be talking about those things. And you do pick those kind of themes from certain AI tools where they just talk about the same stuff over and over. And I think that's going to be a really big issue for people, especially that aren't particularly savvy with AI, that are first-time users. They're not going to realize just how bad some of the stuff sounds, because it's already been written 1,000 times before on different websites.
Yeah. Well, I think with AI, it's really more of a problem of progress. If you look into, let's say, 19th century, or even 18th century, you had libraries where people could go into places, and obviously it was difficult, and not everyone could read, but essentially you could find information and really learn a lot about things. Then we basically had the era of internet, where all that stuff became available online. And every time things like that happen, people think, hey, now everyone's going to get super smart, or potentially things will, books will stop selling and so on. But we have a very polar response from the market, or the society, if you like. And I think the same thing is happening with AI as well. Things become so simple that people underestimate the necessity of putting in the work, putting in the hours in order to actually get an outcome. And I think, no pain, no gain is probably the best phrase I could put forward towards AI, which I think, in my opinion, the reason why you end up with a lot of content which is very mediocre, where everything looks very waffly, and essentially people who produce that content don't really take the time to go through it. So I think it's a huge issue, but it's good to see that obviously it's getting more and more embraced, and I think over time it will evolve. But at the same time, I do think that we should really be focusing on educating people and forming new habits, as opposed to just applying technology without the follow through. Because I would agree with Elon Musk. I think the whole thing is a bit premature as how it's being released into the society, and people just jumping on it to do all sorts of stupid stuff. And I agree. If you do anything in relation to content writing for a business, efficiency, those sort of words jump out a lot. But if you then go and go through things like history or geography or English essays, everything just is actually looking pretty good, which is quite alarming, because that actually attracts quite a few students who are not really keen on doing their homework themselves, and suddenly want to get AI to do it for you.
So just to get a little bit philosophical on you. So I see if you look at the history of the development of technology, especially since the microprocessor forward, what we've really seen is an acceleration of information, and both the ability to create information faster, to distribute information faster, to access information faster. And if you look at the early era of computing, it was all about creating stuff better, right? So word processing and things like that. That was really the messaging of the 80s and 90s. Then we come into the internet era, and all of a sudden it's about, well, now we can actually publish and distribute and access that content much more efficiently. And then it became a case of, well, now let's increase the amount of bandwidth we've got. Now we've got video content. So again, it's just been this arms race of content production and consumption. And AI to me is an interesting one, because in some respects it has been the function of trying to solve the problem of, now there is too much content, and no single person can ever feasibly consume all the content in the world. It's impossible, not even a fraction of it. So what does that leave us? Well, if we want to benefit from all of that information and that wisdom and that content that's out there, what if we had a machine that was able to read all of that and then just give us the answers? Right, it's a little bit like the machine out of Hitchhiker's Guide, right? You can ask it about what's the meaning of life, and it just knows everything, so it can answer that question. And that's a really noble reason for wanting to do it, but at the same time, it creates a whole new problem, because this machine can't just consume content and answer questions. It can create content as well, and it can create content based on other content. So now what it's doing is, it's not just solving the problem of how do we get succinct answers from a large diversity of content. It's creating a new problem, because it's accelerating the creation of that content as well. And you can say what you want about AI, but the quality of the content it produces is still not quite there, right? So if anything, it's creating what I think is becoming a self-feeding loop. where it is accelerating content creation, which is creating a bigger burden on content consumption, and so the cycle continues.
Yeah, it's like a snake trying to eat itself. Yeah, I get it.
Absolutely.
All right. In terms of small businesses, do you have any tips for small businesses, I guess, from your professional standpoint of, IT, AI, or anything else? I mean, we sort of got so much information being thrown at users, and, I just want to see if our listeners, small business owners, could actually benefit from some of your tips. Anything that you could potentially advise or recommend focusing on?
Look, I think there's really two things that are key, and one I'm going to zero in on. It's a super specific one, but it still remains probably the most important technical thing that you can do to secure your applications, your data, and that's enable multi-factor authentication on everything. Now, everyone's probably heard that before, but I'm going to say it again. It is literally the biggest impact thing that you can do. It's not bulletproof. It can be bypassed under certain situations. It's not a panacea that solves all your security woes, but it 100% is the most impactful thing you can do. So anything that supports multi-factor, whether it's Microsoft or Google or your social media accounts, anywhere you see MFA, 2FA, two-step authentication, whatever term they use, where you can use a mobile phone to put a code in or anything like that, just turn it on, right? That's the most critical thing you can do. The second thing is a little bit more generic, and that is if you're a small business owner and you don't have somebody who's kind of got your back from a tech perspective, you really need to find someone, right? If you've got someone who's like an IT guy that you call every now and again, but that you haven't talked to them for a little while, have a chat about what you can be doing, right? Just reach out to them. It's really, really important to have those touch points with people in the technology space who can help you. Even if you're paying half an hour of someone's time to have that chat or whatever it is, I really encourage you to reach out to those people. A lot of the time they're quite busy in their own businesses. They're not necessarily going to proactively contact you as part of the relationship. But just reach out and call them. If nothing else, than to have a catch up and see what's new and what's going on, because those are going to be able to provide you with the basic guidance on what's right for your business. So if you don't have someone like that, obviously, find out from your peers, other people in the industry. You've hopefully got contacts in the business space. See what they're doing, see who they're using, get referrals, get recommendations. But everyone should have someone who's got their back from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I do come across quite a few small businesses where it's a family member or a son that's looking after their IT ad hoc while they're doing something else, and people don't understand how serious this stuff is until something actually breaks. And then for
Yeah.
someone like yourself to come into play to be able to fix something becomes even more complicated because half the time you can't locate any passwords or access, or it's hard enough to actually find the time to reach that person on time as well because a person may be doing another job and really focusing on something else. So I do advise small business owners to reach out to Martin or companies like Bizguard to basically do a bit of a health check to see where they're at and understand exactly they set up and come up with a bit of a plan in terms of, okay, what if things are going to go south? What if everything's going to break? Or potentially they will get locked out of the email. That's the common one. I do get that quite a lot. Email stops working, not sure what to do. And a lot of the time people reach out to their web developers or marketing agencies, but in reality, they don't have any access over that particular setup, which has been done by another company years and years and years ago. So that's a
The other
hard one.
one, the other one that we see really, really commonly, and sometimes it's from people setting it up themselves, and sometimes it's just from an IT professional setting it up that didn't really understand how to do it properly. But when we take on a client with Microsoft 365, we do find so often some of the fundamental security features are not properly set up. It's super, super common, and in fact, when we do come across a client that has everything set up properly, I like to crack a drink because it's a celebration, right? It's pretty rare. And that just comes from the fact that first of all, it's a huge platform. There's a lot of different things in there, and you do need quite a bit of technical experience to manage that properly. But the really big one is that Microsoft over time keep adding security features, but they're not turned on by default. So especially if you've been using it for a long, long time, or it's almost you could draw a graph, right? The older a Microsoft tenancy is, and the longer a small business has had Microsoft 365, the more security stuff is going to be turned off in that tenancy. So again, that's one of the benefits of having that IT professional that you can call on, is get them to look at your 365, get them to do a review and to make sure that everything's set up securely, because chances are it's not.
Yeah, great. Well, look, Martin, I guess what I like about speaking with you, you make things sound a lot more human. A lot of the time, you do end up talking to a lot of IT companies, and even I sometimes really struggle to make sense out of what they're saying. Sometimes, I mean, IT is hard, and small business owners sometimes just don't have the time nor to understand the jargon to understand exactly what they mean. Do you find that this is a bit of an obstacle altogether for people to engage IT companies?
Look, it really is. And I think as an industry, we've done a really bad job. I think that we have gotten very good at talking tech and not very good at speaking the language of business. And that's been the biggest barrier, I think, to a lot of these things really becoming normal. It's not normal for a small business owner to have a techo conversation on average. Small business owners aren't interested in that, right? And why? It's because there's a different language entirely. So really, where I find IT companies, and not just us, but in general, succeeding with small business is when they can actually sit down and have a business discussion, right? It's the first questions are not about, oh, are you Windows or Mac, or do you have a server? The first question is, hey, what do you do? How do you make money? What's important to you, right? What is it that, what does a good day look like for you? What is it that keeps you up at night as a business owner? And you start with those business problems and then you work backwards to the technology, because a lot of the time, what I find when we do that is the business doesn't just have the wrong technology, but sometimes it has too much technology. So it's one of the funny things that IT cops a lot of flack for always adding more stuff. I like to take things away. Anytime that we can get a customer away from an extra thing that they had and simplify, that's a win. But again, it comes from having the right kind of conversation and from being able to actually speak the right language.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can certainly relate to it. Someone goes and says, "Hey, iPads is a great thing. Let's go and get an iPad for every person." Then you know that they basically kids are using those iPads 6 months later with all the emails set up and everything else still there. Yeah, it's crazy. But anyway, it's the sort of
Yep.
stuff that we see sometimes. Anyway, look, every time I get a guest, I run this section, which is something I call rapid fire. This is where I ask you a question. I just want a simple answer. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's go.
All right. ChatGPT or Google Gemini?
ChatGPT.
Classic one. Apple or Windows?
Ooh, that's tough. I'm going to say Apple devices, but Windows for software.
Okay. And in your opinion, best place for a holiday?
That's very tough. I don't really do holidays, so that's revealing a little bit too much about my psyche.
Okay. Well, where would you go next time you get a chance to go for a holiday?
Look, overseas, definitely Europe. I've done the American circuit, and ironically, my family is from Germany. I've never been there, so it'll be somewhere in that area for sure.
Awesome. Well, Germany is great, mate. I think you will really enjoy it. Martin, thanks very much for finding the time to jump on the podcast. I think our listeners would certainly relate to a lot of the things that you've mentioned. And what would be the best way to get in touch with you if someone wanted to find out more about how you could potentially help them, or basically just speak with you?
Sure. Well, the website, bizguard.com.au, or you can just Google Bizguard. Got a book an appointment link. You can book straight into my calendar if you want to have a chat, or find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Martin, really appreciate your time. I think this has been a valuable conversation for our listeners, and I advise you guys not to take your IT setup and your cybersecurity lightly, because with the amount of various scams that are happening, with the amount of malicious activity that's going on in the world, this is something that really creates a lot of problems for businesses when you least expect it. Anyway, my name is Alexei. This is Better Business Podcast, and I'll chat to you soon.